Welcome back to our news bulletin. We start with Israeli forces which have wounded 41 Palestinians protesting against US President Donald Trump's Middle East peace deal across the West Bank. Palestine Red Crescent Society said Israeli forces fired tear gas and rubber bullets. It said the demonstrators were wounded in the towns of Tulkarem, Al-Bahrain and Arub refugee camp and in villages north of the Jordan Valley. The protesters chanted slogans against the plan, saying Palestine is not for sale. Hundreds of Palestinian refugees took to the streets of Beirut in Lebanon to protest against Trump's deal. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas will visit the UN within 2 weeks to address the Security Council on his rejection of the new plan. Earlier, Israeli warplanes bombed multiple locations in the Gaza Strip. The Israeli Defense Ministry says its jets struck Hamas posts in the southern city of Khan Yunis and the central city of Deir al-Balah. Security officials said 2 successive airstrikes were carried out in retaliation for rocket launches from within the strip. They said a rocket was fired from Gaza into Israel. No casualties have been reported so far. The attack came shortly after Israel announced it would step up its military presence in the West Bank and near Gaza. In a related development, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has urged Palestinians to produce a counteroffer to the Trump peace plan that can win Israeli support. Talking to reporters, Pompeo said Palestinian leaders are free to come up with an appropriate counteroffer. He said Israelis would be prepared to sit down and negotiate on the basis of the president's vision. Palestinians have been protesting against Trump's peace plan, which gives Israel a green light to annex key parts of the occupied West Bank. In the West Bank city of Bethlehem, Israeli border guards fired tear gas at demonstrators. As the threat of coronavirus exacerbates, the death toll from the new coronavirus has risen to 170 in China. With a confirmed case in Tibet, the virus has now spread to every region in mainland China and at least 16 other countries. As China battles coronavirus, over 1,000 new cases of the disease have emerged over the past 24 hours. The EU says nearly 600 European citizens in China want to be repatriated because of the epidemic. The World Health Organization will meet today to discuss whether the virus constitutes a global health emergency. The global health body said despite a small number of cases outside China, the virus holds potential for a much larger outbreak.
But the whole world needs to be on alert now. The whole world needs to take action and be ready for any cases that come, either from the original epicenter or from other epicenters that become established.
In China's Beijing, streets and shopping malls are empty as the coronavirus outbreak overshadows Chinese New Year celebrations. Over 2,000 stores in the country have already been closed because of the epidemic. More in this report.
The week-long Lunar New Year holiday usually sees audiences flooding into cinemas and people with their families crowding into tourist sites. This year is different. Public areas, including every tourist trap, have been closed by fears of the infectious coronavirus. Starbucks now has signs asking customers to wear a mask before entering the cafe.
And now I have to go back early to my home. And I couldn't even see the places that I wanted. Like I really wanted to see the Great Wall and I won't be able to see it. And it's my first time here in Asia and I feel very unlucky.
Another worry is the economy, with residents and investors alike concerned by the economic hit the disease will cause. It's believed output could be reduced and businesses at every level undermined by travel restrictions introduced by the government to slow the spread of the virus.
I am sure it will affect the national economy. It's during the Spring Festival and it's in the holiday season. However, you see, there are not many people on the streets in Beijing. I feel the impact will be extremely big. Therefore, I hope people in Hubei will stop eating wild animals and food without inspection. I think it's a disaster.
170 people have lost their lives so far as the virus spreads its reach across China and into at least 16 other countries.
Pakistan's army has killed 5 terrorists in an operation in Dattakhel town of North Waziristan. Army's media wing says 2 army soldiers, Mohammad Shamim and Asad Khan, were martyred during the operation. Inter-Services Public Relations said the operation was conducted on intelligence information. In Brexit, the European Parliament has given its final approval to Britain's divorce deal from the bloc. The approval has paved the way for Brexit to take place on Friday.
Members of the European Parliament have overwhelmingly backed the terms of UK's departure from the EU. 621 members voted in favour of the withdrawal agreement, while 49 voted against Brexit. Several British members of the European Parliament said they hoped the UK would return one day. Addressing the Parliament, EU Chief Ursula von der Leyen said the bloc will always be there for the EU. Addressing the Parliament, EU Chief Ursula von der Leyen said the bloc will always be there for the UK.
We will miss you, but we will always keep up our friendship with you, and you can count on us as we know that we can count on you.
The UK is due to leave the bloc at 11 p.m. GMT on Friday, and the withdrawal agreement is expected to be signed off in Brussels later. But Eurosceptics, including the Brexit Party's Nigel Farage, used their final speeches to slam the EU. He said there is no going back from this point.
On the 31st of January 2020, we leave the European Union and we pass the point of no return. That is the significance of this week.
After Brexit, the UK will become what the EU calls a third country, which means it will be outside the Union but still close to the bloc, like Norway and Switzerland.
In a related development, Britain is preparing to leave the EU while the bloc's Brexit negotiator Michel Barnier warned this week of the fresh risk of a cliff edge at the end of 2020. In the meantime, Northern Ireland violin maker Martin McLean is aware of the uncertainty that overshadows the province's trading status. More in this report.
Martin McLean strikes a cheerful tune in his Northern Ireland studio. But with Brexit days away, the violin maker is preparing to face the music. For a hefty fee, McLean makes instruments sought after the world over.
I make bespoke, high-end violins that are suitable for concert musicians. And I suppose what I'm doing is I'm recreating the sound that those famous violins like Stradivari's and Guarneri's and so on that they can produce, the sort of sound that can fill a concert hall and wow an audience and excite a musician.
Little will change in Northern Ireland on the day Britain leaves the EU. But after a year-long transition period, new custom checks are likely at ports like Warren Point. That's because Britain has promised Northern Irish regulations will stay aligned to the Irish Republic, while the rest of the UK could change its rules. And that's already worrying business owners like Martin.
I mean, I have a couple of wood dealers that will come and visit me 3 times a year, and I can sort through their stock and I can pick out the wood that I like the most. And I think that they're certainly of the view that that's not going to happen anymore. You know, that they're not going to be able to make that journey. So that's going to make it more expensive. You know, it will mean more travel and so on to buy materials.
The Northern Ireland Federation of Small Businesses say their clients remain concerned, as there's still little clarity on how controls will affect their members. The EU has also warned danger of a hard Brexit has not gone away.
If we have no agreement, it will not be business as usual and the statu quo. We have to face a risk of a cliff edge, in particular for trade.
With so much unclear for Martin, the only option is to play it by ear.
US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has arrived in the UK to urge London to rethink its decision regarding China's Huawei. The US is concerned that the UK's 5G decision will give China the upper hand in a technological race of the 21st century. Pompeo will discuss London's decision to ignore Washington's warnings by giving Huawei a limited but leading role in 5G networks. Earlier, Pompeo said American information should only pass through trusted networks. A post-Brexit trade deal between London and Washington is also on the agenda. But domestic pressures on UK PM Boris Johnson to stand up to Washington may complicate any prospective deal. Tensions seem to be mounting between US and Russia as the US has issued fresh sanctions on Russia over its annexation of Crimea. The US Treasury Department has blacklisted 8 individuals and a Moscow-based railway company. In a statement, the department said it blacklisted Crimea's pro-Russian Prime Minister Yuri Gotsenyuk. It said the Grand Service Express that operates in Crimea has also been sanctioned. The Treasury Department said the individuals were being sanctioned by both Canada and the EU. The Russian embassy in Washington says the sanctions will not make Moscow change its policies. It said the curbs will only erode the basis for bilateral cooperation. The Council of Europe's Parliamentary Assembly has voted to fully restore rights of the Russian delegation. Officials say 96 lawmakers voted in favor, while 44 were against the move and 7 abstained from voting. The draft resolution says the Assembly wants to assess the progress made until PACE co-rapporteurs visit Russia. The PACE noted Russia has fulfilled some recommendations included in the resolution for its return to the body. The measures included Moscow's participation in prisoner swaps with Ukraine and progress towards Minsk agreements. Members of the PACE drafted the resolution in June last year. Russia has rejected UN Secretariat's data on civilian casualties in Syria's Idlib province. This comes after UN Under-Secretary General Mark Lowcock accused Syria's government and its allies of killing civilians in airstrikes. At the UN Security Council meeting last night, Britain and the US accused Russia and China of cutting humanitarian aid for millions of Syrians. Denying the accusations, Syria's representative to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, said the source of UN data on Syrian casualties is unknown. Meanwhile, Russia's defense ministry claims no civilians were affected in the attack by Syrian government forces against militants in Idlib. It said they are working in the town of Maratul Numan, retaken from militants, to provide civilians with food and daily necessities. We have a lot more coming up right after this short break, so stay tuned. Welcome back. The U.S. Department of Defense has identified its 2 airmen killed in a military plane crash in Afghanistan. On Monday, the Taliban claimed shooting down the Bombardier E-11A used by U.S. forces for battlefield communications. Pentagon said 46-year-old Colonel Paul Voss, who previously served Virginia Air Command headquarters, was among the dead. It said the second airman was 30-year-old Captain Ryan Fanoff from Hudson, New Hampshire. The Pentagon said the men were supporting Operation Freedom Sentinel for the U.S. mission in Afghanistan. A Turkish think tank held a roundtable session on India's controversial Citizenship Act, which many consider anti-Muslim. The discussion was organized by the Istanbul-based South Asia Strategic Research Center and attended by academics. Addressing the event, speakers said the Constitution of India is being violated through this new law. They said India's BJP is demographically engineering occupied Kashmir to erode its Muslim majority. The speaker said there is a political understanding in India which discriminates against minorities. India has been witnessing extensive protests against the law since it received presidential approval on December 12th. A New York-based committee to protect journalists has denounced India's claim of restoring internet in occupied Kashmir. Last week, New Delhi restored 2G internet in the valley after 6 months with access to only 300 whitelist websites. In a statement, the committee said, the New Delhi's claim is a complete farce. It said all news websites are still blocked and journalists do not have the right speed and quality of the internet for work. It said India's curb on internet services is a complete disregard for the right to freedom of speech. The committee demanded complete restoration of the internet immediately. Turkey says France is responsible for Libya's instability, accusing Paris of wanting to control Tripoli's natural resources. Turkish Foreign Ministry spokesperson Hami Aksoy said Paris has been supporting Libyan strongman Khalifa Haftar since 2011. Aksoy said France should stop backing Haftar if it wants to implement decisions taken at this month's Berlin conference. He said Haftar's attack on the legitimate government is a threat to the country's territorial integrity and sovereignty. The remarks came after French President Emmanuel Macron accused Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of ramping up interference in Libya. Macron claimed Turkish ships carrying Syrian mercenaries have been seen arriving on Libyan soil. In France, thousands of demonstrators have marched in Paris against the government's pension reforms. The city's streets have been filled with trade unionists and other demonstrators. Protesters say over 60% of people are against the pensions bill. The demonstrators say they cannot accept the degradation of their rights. Mostly trade unionists, the protesters shout anti-Macron slogans in their march from the Place d'Italia to the capital's iconic Palais Royal. The march comes a day after the French parliament started examining the pension reform bill. A Danish newspaper has refused to apologize to China over a satirical cartoon it published about the deadly new virus. China's embassy in Denmark called the cartoon an insult to the country. In a statement, it said the paper, Jyllands-Posten, and cartoonist Niels Boe-Bergesen must publicly apologize to the Chinese people. The coronavirus cartoon furor has spread to social media, with many Danes jumping to the newspaper's defense. Responding, Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen said Copenhagen has freedom of expression. In the meantime, Finland has become the first Nordic country to confirm a coronavirus case, saying 15 others may have been exposed. The American aerospace company SpaceX has launched its fourth batch of 60 Starlink satellites. This is the second part of its 2020 push to put 1,500 satellites into orbit by the end of the year.
2, 1, 0. Ignition, liftoff.
A sooty Falcon 9 rocket roared to life, lifting off from Space Launch Complex at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station in Florida. The rocket carried 60 more Starlink satellites for SpaceX's growing constellation. The satellites all successfully deployed to low Earth orbit about an hour after liftoff. Last May, SpaceX launched the first batch of operational satellites. There are now 240 circling the Earth. SpaceX eventually wants to fly humans to the International Space Station.
Right, and yes.
A positive development as the Pakistani government is holding a two-day conference in Kenya in a major trade outreach to Africa. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi has already arrived in Nairobi to attend Pakistan-Africa Trade Development Conference being held on Thursday and Friday. Earlier, in a statement, the Foreign Office said Commerce and Foreign Ministries are hosting the conference that will strengthen economic ties between the two countries. It said Kenyan cabinet members, dignitaries from other African states, and Pakistani envoys in Africa will attend the conference. It said the move is part of Pakistan's Engage Africa initiative to forge closer ties with the African continent. The U.S. Federal Reserve is to hold interest rates steady, pointing to modest economic growth and a strong job market. The Fed's policy-making committee will keep the target range between 1.5% and 1.75%. The central bank is keeping quiet on its purchase of U.S. Treasury bills worth $60 billion a month to maintain liquidity in bank funding markets. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell said monetary policy is positioned to support growth.
I would say now there are grounds for what I would call cautious optimism about the outlook now for the global economy. Many analysts are predicting a pickup in growth this year, although still to relatively modest growth rates, and people are pointing to, we would point to supportive financial conditions, the easing of trade tensions.
U.S. President Donald Trump has signed a new North American trade agreement at the White House. This ceremony ended 2 years of negotiations over the continent's trade rules. At the White House, President Trump said NAFTA nightmare has finally come to an end. He said the new U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement replaced a disastrous trade deal and will keep jobs and wealth in America. The president said he is fighting for American workers.
Said this was a deal that could not be done. Too complicated, too big, couldn't be done, we got it done. And today we're finally ending the NAFTA nightmare and signing into law the brand new U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement.
U.S. aircraft manufacturer Boeing has reported its first annual loss in over 2 decades. The deficit comes amid the grounding of its 737 MAX jet, which undermined company revenues and exploded costs. In a statement, the aerospace giant reported its fourth quarter financial results. It recorded a $1 billion loss in the fourth quarter and an overall loss of $636 million in 2019. This is Boeing's first year in the red since 1997. Newly installed Chief Executive David Calhoun said he hopes regulators will allow the 737 MAX to return to service by the middle of this year. The MAX has been grounded since March after 2 crashes that killed nearly 400 people. Stock markets across Asia are trading lower as investors continue to weigh developments on the ongoing coronavirus outbreak. Investor sentiments continue to dampen as major travel and leisure stocks lose steam amid slowing global economic activity. Hong Kong's Hang Seng has lost over 2%. Nikkei 225 is trading nearly 2% lower. Seoul's Kospi Index has also lost nearly 2% after Samsung Electronics shares fell over 2.5%. Meanwhile, international oil prices have also lost over 1% of global economic activity contracts. Now let's look at the weather from around the globe. This is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news.